In the spring of 1944, amid the thunder of artillery and the chaos of one of World War II's most brutal battles, soldiers of the Polish Second Corps witnessed something extraordinary at Monte Cassino. As shells screamed overhead and the ancient monastery fortress loomed above them, a massive brown bear walked calmly through the gunfire, carrying crates of artillery ammunition in his arms. He moved with purpose, unbothered by the explosions, delivering his deadly cargo to the gun crews who desperately needed it. This was not a hallucination born of combat fatigue. This was Wojtek, a Syrian brown bear who held official rank in the Polish army and would become one of the most unusual soldiers of the Second World War. The story of Wojtek seems almost impossible, a tale too strange for the grim reality of global conflict. Yet it is entirely true, documented in military records, photographs, and the memories of thousands of Polish soldiers who served alongside him. How does a bear become a soldier? How does an animal join the ranks of an army fighting thousands of miles from home, carrying the weight of a nation's hopes on its shoulders? The answer lies in a journey that spans continents, a story of survival, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war. To understand Wojciech's story, we must first understand the Polish soldiers who adopted him. These were not ordinary troops. They were men who had already endured more suffering than most could imagine. Deported to Soviet labor camps after the dual invasion of Poland in 1939, they had survived the frozen wastes of Siberia, where hundreds of thousands of their countrymen perished. When Hitler turned on Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, these Polish prisoners were suddenly transformed from enemies into reluctant allies. Released from the gulags, they were permitted to form a Polish army in exile under British command, a force that would fight its way across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually Italy. These soldiers carried with them a profound sense of loss. Their homeland was occupied, their families scattered or dead, their entire world upended. They were warriors without a country to return to, fighting not for territory but for the very idea of Poland itself. In this context of displacement and determination, a small bear cub would become far more than a mascot. He would become a symbol of resilience, a living reminder that even in the darkest times, life and hope could endure. The year was 1942. The newly formed Polish Anders Army, named for its commander General the Ladislaw Anders, was making its way through Persia, modern-day Iran, having evacuated from the Soviet Union. The soldiers were still recovering from their ordeal in the camps, malnourished and exhausted, but they were free and they were armed. They were heading south toward Palestine and Egypt, where they would train and prepare to enter the war in earnest. It was during this march through the rugged Persian mountains that a small group of soldiers encountered a local boy carrying something unusual. He was trying to sell the contents of a burlap sack. Inside was a Syrian brown bear cub, barely a few months old, orphaned after hunters had killed his mother. The soldiers, moved by compassion and perhaps seeking a connection to something innocent in their harsh world, purchased the cub with a few cans of food and some coins. They named him Wojciech, a diminutive of Wojciech, a common Polish name that means, "he who enjoys war," or "smiling warrior." At the time, they could not have known how prophetic this name would prove to be. The tiny cub, weak and frightened, was adopted by a company of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. He would never leave them. In those early days, Wojciech was completely dependent on his human family. The soldiers fed him condensed milk from an old vodka bottle, holding him like an infant as he drank. They fashioned a makeshift den for him in their supply trucks, surrounding him with blankets and whatever soft materials they could find. At night, when temperatures dropped in the desert, soldiers would take turns keeping the cub warm, cradling him against their bodies. For men who had lost everything, caring for this helpless creature provided a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. As Wojciech grew, so did his personality. He was remarkably intelligent and social, traits that endeared him to everyone in the unit. He learned to recognize individual soldiers, greeting his favorites with excited grunts and gentle pushes. He followed the men everywhere, padding along behind them during drills and exercises. When the company moved camp, Wojtek rode in the trucks, his massive head hanging out the window, tongue lolling in the wind like an enormous dog. Soldiers from other units would stop and stare, unable to believe their eyes, but for the men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, Wojtek was simply one of them. The bear's diet evolved as he grew. While he started on milk, he quickly developed a taste for fruit, honey, and surprisingly, beer. The soldiers discovered that Wojtek loved beer above almost anything else, and he learned to beg for it in his own way, standing on his hind legs and opening his mouth expectantly. He was also fond of cigarettes, though he did not smoke them in the traditional sense. Instead, he would eat them, seeming to enjoy the tobacco. These habits, while amusing to his companions, were carefully monitored. The soldiers treated Wojtek with genuine affection and ensured he was never given so much alcohol that it harmed him. But Wojtek was not merely a pet or a novelty. As the Polish forces moved from Persia to Palestine and then to Egypt, military regulations became stricter. British command structures did not include provisions for animal mascots traveling with combat units, especially not bears. When the Polish Second Corps received orders to embark for Italy in 1943, military authorities made it clear that only official soldiers would be permitted on the transport ships. No pets, no mascots, no exceptions. The men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company faced an impossible choice: leave Wojtek behind or find another way. They chose the latter. In an extraordinary display of bureaucratic creativity and determination, the soldiers officially enlisted Wojtek in the Polish army. He was given a serial number, a pay book, and a rank. Private Wojtek became a legitimate soldier of the Polish Second Corps. His pay, like that of the other soldiers, was recorded in official documents, though it was used to purchase his food and supplies. This was not merely a symbolic gesture or a clever trick. The paperwork was genuine, processed through official military channels, and Wojtek's name appeared on the company roster alongside his human brothers in arms. With his status formalized, Wojtek boarded the transport ship bound for Italy. The journey across the Mediterranean was crowded and uncomfortable for everyone aboard, but Wojtek adapted. He had become accustomed to military life, to the routines and rhythms of the camp. He understood, in his own way, that he belonged to these men and they to him. When the ships arrived in Italy in early 1944, Wojtek disembarked with his unit, officially a soldier in an army preparing for one of the war's most challenging campaigns. Italy in 1944 was a landscape of devastation. The Allied advance up the peninsula had stalled at the Gustav Line, a formidable series of German defensive positions anchored by the fortress monastery of Monte Cassino. This ancient Benedictine abbey sat atop a steep mountain, dominating the Lira Valley and the road to Rome. The Germans had transformed it into a nearly impregnable stronghold, and 3 previous Allied assaults had failed with horrific casualties. The Polish Second Corps was assigned to take Monte Cassino in a 4th attempt, a task that seemed almost suicidal. The men knew the odds. They had already survived the impossible once, escaping the Soviet camps. Now they would be asked to do it again. The Battle of Monte Cassino began in earnest for the Polish forces on May 11, 1944. The plan called for a massive artillery barrage followed by infantry assault up the treacherous slopes. The German defenders, members of the elite 1st Parachute Division, were dug into positions that had been fortified over months. They had overlapping fields of fire, extensive minefields, and the advantage of high ground. Every meter of advance would cost blood. In the days leading up to the assault, the Polish artillery units worked ceaselessly to establish their positions and stockpile ammunition. This was where Wojtek's role transformed from mascot to active participant. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was responsible for keeping the guns supplied with shells, a backbreaking task that required moving hundreds of heavy crates from supply dumps to forward positions. Each crate weighed approximately 40 pounds and contained 4 25-pound artillery shells. Men worked in pairs, struggling with the weight and the rough terrain, all while under sporadic German fire. Wojtek observed this activity with his characteristic curiosity. He had always been fascinated by the work of his human companions, and he had learned to mimic their actions in play. But this was different. The soldiers were exhausted, working around the clock, and Wojtek seemed to sense their urgency. One of the soldiers, either as an experiment or out of desperation, showed Wojtek how to pick up one of the smaller ammunition crates. To everyone's astonishment, the bear understood immediately. He gripped the crate in his massive forearms, stood upright, and carried it to where the soldier indicated. From that moment forward, Wojtek became an integral part of the supply operation. He worked alongside the men, carrying ammunition crates from the trucks to the gun emplacements. Unlike the human soldiers who needed to work in pairs and rest frequently, Wojtek could carry the crates alone and showed no signs of fatigue. He made trip after trip, walking calmly through the chaos of the battlefield. Artillery rounds from both sides screamed overhead, the ground shook with explosions, smoke obscured the sky, and through it all, a massive bear walked upright, delivering ammunition to the guns. The soldiers were astounded. Some had initially doubted whether Wojtek truly understood what he was doing or if his participation was merely a fortunate accident. But as the days of battle stretched on, it became clear that Wojtek was deliberately helping. He responded to instructions, stayed focused on his task, and showed remarkable composure under fire. Where human soldiers might flinch at an explosion, Wojtek continued his work. He had been raised in the company of these men, had lived through training exercises and artillery practice. The sounds of war, while deafening, were familiar to him. The battle itself was a nightmare of close-quarters combat and grinding attrition. Polish infantry advanced up the slopes in the darkness, navigating through minefields and barbed wire, only to be met with murderous fire from German machine gun nests and mortars. Officers led from the front and died at appalling rates. Entire companies were decimated in minutes. The monastery, already reduced to rubble by earlier Allied bombing, still provided the Germans with excellent defensive positions among the ruins. Polish soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing that their homeland depended on their success here, that the world needed to see Polish forces triumph. Through 3 days and nights of continuous combat, the Polish artillery provided crucial support, and the 22nd Artillery Supply Company ensured the guns never went silent for lack of ammunition. Wojtek was there for all of it, a constant presence, moving ammunition when needed and providing a strange sense of normalcy in the madness. Soldiers who saw him found their spirits lifted, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Here was proof that life could exist in the midst of death, that courage came in unexpected forms. On May 18, 1944, after days of savage fighting and over 3,000 Polish casualties, soldiers of the 12th Podolski Regiment reached the summit of Monte Cassino. The German defenders, having fought with skill and determination, finally withdrew during the night. When the Poles raised their regimental flag over the ruins of the monastery at dawn, it marked not just a military victory but a moment of profound symbolic importance. Poland, occupied and divided, still fought. Its soldiers, cast to the winds by the twin invasions of 1939, had proven their valor on one of the war's most difficult battlefields. Wojtek had been part of that victory. He had served alongside his human companions, contributing in his own unique way to the success of the operation. The story of the bear who carried ammunition at Monte Cassino spread rapidly through the Allied forces. Correspondents wrote articles, photographers captured images, and soon Wojtek became famous far beyond the Polish Second Corps. He was featured in newsreels, visited by generals and dignitaries, and celebrated as a symbol of the unusual and extraordinary nature of war. But for the soldiers who served with him, Wojtek meant something deeper than publicity or curiosity. He represented their journey, their survival against impossible odds, their refusal to surrender hope. They had found him as a helpless cub when they themselves were refugees, barely recovered from Soviet camps. They had raised him while rebuilding their strength and purpose. And now he had fought beside them in battle, sharing their danger and their triumph. In a very real sense, Wojtek's story mirrored their own, displaced, adopted into a new family, and forged into a warrior by necessity and loyalty. After Monte Cassino, the Polish Second Corps continued fighting up the Italian peninsula. They participated in the liberation of Bologna and other operations, pushing the Germans northward toward final defeat. Wojtek remained with his unit throughout, his fame growing but his routine largely unchanged. He still slept in the company area, still begged for beer and cigarettes, still wrestled playfully with soldiers who dared to engage him. He had grown to enormous size, weighing over 500 pounds, immensely strong but remarkably gentle with his human companions. The soldiers developed elaborate stories about Wojtek's exploits, some exaggerated but many based on genuine incidents. He once discovered a spy hiding in the bathhouse, an Arab man who had infiltrated the camp. Wojtek's roars and aggressive display alerted the guards, who captured the intruder. Another time, he broke into a storage area and consumed a large quantity of honey, falling into a contented sleep surrounded by empty jars. These tales became part of the unit's folklore, told and retold around campfires and in letters home. As the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945, the Polish soldiers faced a new and bitter reality. Their homeland, which they had fought so hard to free, would not be truly free. The Yalta Conference had placed Poland under Soviet influence, establishing a communist government that many of the Anders Army veterans refused to recognize. Returning home meant living under the very system from which they had escaped, facing potential persecution for their service with the Western Allies. Many chose exile instead, settling in Britain, which offered refuge to the Polish forces that had fought under British command. In 1946, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company was relocated to Scotland, eventually settling near the village of Hutton in the Scottish borders. The war was over, but Wojtek's service continued. He lived with the soldiers in their barracks, maintaining the routines and bonds that had sustained them through years of conflict. But the unit was being demobilized. Men were being released from service, beginning new civilian lives. The question of what to do with Wojtek became pressing. Keeping a 500-pound bear in civilian life was impractical and potentially dangerous, despite Wojtek's gentle nature with those he knew. The soldiers, displaying the same protective instinct they had always shown, found a solution. The Edinburgh Zoo agreed to take Wojtek, providing him with a permanent home where he would be cared for and where his former comrades could visit him. In 1947, Wojtek was officially transferred to the zoo, his military service concluded after 5 years. The transition was difficult for everyone involved. Soldiers who had served with Wojtek for years came to the zoo to say goodbye, some of them weeping openly. They brought him his favorite treats, cigarettes, beer, sweets. They spoke to him in Polish, the language he had heard since cubhood. Wojtek responded to them as he always had, with recognition and affection, pressing against the bars of his enclosure to be near them. For these men, leaving Wojtek behind was another loss in a long series of losses, another connection to their past that could not be maintained in their new lives. But the visits continued. Former soldiers of the Polish Second Corps who had settled in Scotland made regular trips to Edinburgh to see Wojtek. They would call to him in Polish, and he would respond, coming to the edge of his enclosure with clear excitement. Zoo staff noted that Wojtek reacted differently to Polish speakers than to other visitors, displaying behaviors he showed for no one else. He remained connected to his military family, even in captivity. Wojtek lived at the Edinburgh Zoo for 16 years, until his death in December 1963 at the age of 21. During those years, he remained a popular attraction, his story told to thousands of visitors. Children who came to see the bears were amazed to learn that this massive creature had been a soldier, that he had carried ammunition under fire, that he had shared in one of history's great battles. For the Polish expatriate community, Wojtek was more than a curiosity. He was a living link to their sacrifices and their service, a reminder that their contributions to the Allied victory had been real and significant. The story of Wojtek matters because it illuminates a larger truth about the Second World War and the human experience of that conflict. The Polish soldiers who adopted a bear cub in the mountains of Persia were men who had been stripped of everything: their homes, their families, their country, their freedom. They had survived Stalin's camps through sheer will and fortune. When they found Wojtek, they were still rebuilding themselves, transforming from broken prisoners into soldiers once more. In caring for a helpless creature, they reclaimed their humanity. In teaching that creature to be part of their unit, they created something unique and extraordinary. Wojtek's participation in the Battle of Monte Cassino was not merely a curiosity or a footnote. It was a genuine contribution to a desperately fought battle, and it provided incalculable morale value to men who needed every source of strength they could find. The image of a bear calmly carrying ammunition through artillery fire became a symbol of unshakable courage and loyalty, qualities the Polish forces displayed in abundance during their long and difficult war. Today, Wojtek is commemorated in monuments in Scotland and Poland. A statue in Edinburgh's Prince's Street Garden shows him carrying an artillery shell, forever frozen in his most famous role. In Poland, he is remembered as a symbol of the nation's wartime resilience and the extraordinary journey of the Anders Army. Children's books, documentaries, and historical studies have ensured that his story endures, passed down to new generations who might otherwise never know that once a bear served in the Polish army and helped win a crucial battle. The last of Wojtek's soldier companions have now passed away, taking with them their first-hand memories of the bear who shared their war. But the documentary evidence remains: photographs, military records, eyewitness accounts, and the deep impression Wojtek left on everyone who encountered him. His story transcends simple novelty. It speaks to the bonds that form in extremity, the unexpected sources of hope in darkness, and the truth that courage and loyalty can be found in the most unlikely places. Private Wojtek, soldier of the Polish Second Corps, earned his place in history not through human valor but through an animal's simple dedication to the family that raised him. In doing so, he became immortal.